There's a bunch of different sandpaper out there. How do you know which one to use? How do you know when to use it? In this video, I'm going to show you how. Which one to use, when to use it, what's the process like. It's really simple once you know it. And if you watch this video, you'll know it. Check it out. Sanding. Nobody likes it, but it's a job that has to get done. So until you hire that other young buck to come in and do that job for you, you're going to have to do it yourself. Let me show you how to do it. First off, there are many different types of sandpaper. Which one do you choose? Well, first off, that's going to depend on the sander you've got. Most of you probably have a random orbital sander. That was on purpose. This is probably the most common, and I would say, personally, I think it's the best power sander out there for your standard job, right? If you've got certain different jobs, you may want like a detail sander or a square face, but the random orbital is kind of the industry standard. There's much better versions than this one. This one, I like it, but it is not the top of the line. I've heard that Festool has the best. I don't know if that's true. If you have Festool and you've used it, let me know in the comments. Is it the best? Is it worth that money? Or is it just an overpriced power sander? You're going to need different grits. What are grits? Grits are basically, in layman terms, how rough that sandpaper is. Okay? It's the number of shards. There's like, typically they use fiberglass. Sometimes they used to use sand, maybe they still do, depending on the company. The number of grains in a square inch. So that means this right here is 80 grit with the random orbital. Typically they will write it on the back in case you lose the piece. This is going to be a rougher piece of sandpaper. You're going to want to start with your lower grits. So 80 is what I like to start with. Some people start with 60, 80. It's not going to make a huge difference because you're going to be jumping up several tens, if you will. If not, you don't typically jump hundreds until you get to the high numbers. So you will start with 80 grit or 60 grit, basically a lower number grit. And you're going to work your way up to the higher grits until you've got a nice smooth piece. Now, there's a couple things to keep in mind when you are sanding. Number one, I have this mat right here. It's just a moving blanket, nothing fancy, but it's something to keep my piece steady. It keeps it from moving around too much because obviously it's vibrating with this power sander going. But also it keeps the underside of it, the side that is on the table, from getting scratched up and messed up so that I don't have to sand it again. So some sort of pad is preferable. It's not the end of the world if you don't have it, but you'll find that it saves you time by doing that, putting something down underneath it so you have something to keep it steady and keep it nice and clean. Then you're going to want to make sure you have your power sander hooked up to a vacuum. A couple pieces that hook this up, and that allows me to collect most of the dust that I create when I'm sanding. Now, the holes right here on your power sander is where the vacuum is actually working. So make sure you line the holes up with the holes that come in your sandpaper. If you don't do that, you're kind of eliminating the fact that you have a vacuum attached to it. You gotta have those holes lined up. Doesn't have to be perfect, but you got it. The clearer they are, the more they're going to suck it up, which is what you want. You want it to suck up. The other type of sandpaper you may find is a mesh sandpaper. I have mixed reviews on that. I think if you are just doing a finish sand, like your higher grits, I like the mesh. I think it works well. It allows for maximum suction because the whole thing is kind of got the mesh with the fiberglass and stuff on top of that, which that's not bad. That's a pretty good thing. The problem I have with the lower grits on that is that I feel like it gets gunked up a little bit more, which then eliminates the fact that it doesn't suck as well, and then also it doesn't sand as well. Because when it gets all gunked up, you either have to clean it or you got to get a new sandpaper because it is no longer doing its job. So, and you'll find that often if you ever do refinishing, that's where you really feel it because you're sanding off an old finish and it just takes forever. So, make sure that you have a good suction. Then, when you are sanding, you're going to want to move slowly. And if you've ever done some sanding and you see after you put finish on, typically, little swirl marks, that's your sander. That's typically because you're moving too fast. Now, there's a couple other things that could lead to that, but typically it's because you're moving too quickly. You're not giving the sander enough time to clean that up. So you want to move. I've been told, I've heard a lot of industry professionals say about an inch a second, which may seem quickly, but it's like nice and easy, back and forth, going over your piece. And the other thing you want to make sure you do is that you're covering the whole piece. There's two ways to really make sure you're doing it. Number one, which a lot of people tend to do, get a pencil or some sort of like chalk, something very light, and just lightly mark all over your piece. Typically you do this with the lower grits to make sure you smooth out the entire piece. And it's not always done with the super high grits like the 400 and plus, but that's one way. It's a good way. I've done that a few times. Another way to do it is basically just do a grid pattern. So if I know, for example, this is the shelf that I have to sand, that I'm going to sand during this video. Okay, nice little maple floating shelf. In order to ensure that I hit every part of this shelf, I am going to move in a grid pattern, up and down like this, nice and slow. And when I get all the way to the end, I will then go horizontal all the way across. And that ensures that I'm hitting the entire piece. So there are multiple ways to do it. So that's what I like to do, is do the grid pattern. Grid, pencil, either way really works as long as you make sure you are hitting the entire piece, because that even sand is what's going to give you that good look at the end. I'm going to sand this real quick and I'll bring you back for the next part. Okay, so a couple things you should notice about how I did that. First things first, sander sits flat on the piece. Okay, whenever you try to get into where you're turning it, you know, some people, and I've even been guilty of this before, trying to really get a piece apart smooth, and they'll kind of tilt it and really dig in. All you're doing is making a dent in it, and that's not going to help you in the long run. You want to keep this thing flat so you have a nice smooth surface across. Second thing, I like to come back with either a rag or some compressed air. I don't have my compressor on right now, so a microfiber rag, which you can find at Harbor Freight. Harbor Freight, you say? Well, there happens to be a video that I just put out last week about Harbor Freight and when to use it and when you shouldn't. There'll be a link to that in the description. When you get back from Harbor Freight and buying all your cheap microfiber rags, because they always go bad quickly, make sure that you get all that dust off there. It just helps to start with a clean surface when you're doing your next round. So you're going to go typically 80, 120, or 150, whatever you want to do. Then from 120 or 150, you'll go to either 180 or 220, whichever you prefer. Somewhere in that range. You don't need to go through every single grit, right? That I feel like is a waste of time. I've done plenty of woodworking projects where I get silky smooth finishes and I didn't go through every single grit. So if anybody tells you you have to, I disagree. And I've got the woodworking projects to prove it. So you can, it won't hurt you, it's just a waste of time. The other thing you'll notice is that because these shelves are hardwood faces and plywood, for the body of it, I don't like putting 80 grit on plywood because if you dig into it at all, you're going to go right through that top veneer and then you're screwed and you got to redo the entire thing, especially because these are getting stained. You don't want to do that because it will show. So I like to wait and do the plywood portion of it at the 120 mark. That will smooth it out. All right, so we've done the first one. Typically, I would do 120. We would do 120 over the entire thing. And then I like to do a water pop after that. You say, Micah, what's a water pop? Let me show you. I'm going to do 120. I'll do that off camera. You don't need to watch me sand. It's boring. And then I'll show you the water pop, which is the fun part. Okay, now it's time for the water pop. Now, some of you may be asking, what the heck is a water pop? I thought we weren't supposed to put water on wood. Well, water and wood don't really mix, particularly over a long period of time. In a short period of time, it can be beneficial. And let me tell you how. So this is a lot more fun if you're doing it with a species like walnut and even white oak because it shows a lot better. But I'm working on a maple project, so you get to see it on maple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a little spray bottle of water. I'm going to spray the wood. And you say, why would you do that? Why would you get it wet? Here's the benefits. Two things in particular that I think water pops are great for. Number one, it's going to help show any imperfections. So if you do have those little swirl marks, if you do have a little imperfection here or there, it's going to be highlighted because it's like putting finish on it. Whenever you put finish on a piece of wood, it looks like it's wet. Well, by putting water on it, you're kind of getting a little preview. And that's a good thing because now you can make that correction if you need to sand it there again or you need to do something about that little nick or whatever. You can do it before you put finish on the piece. So a water pop, very beneficial for that. Gives you the preview. Number two, it's going to raise the fibers of the wood as it dries. So when it dries, those fibers will stand up. And when they do that, then you come back with your 220 grit and you sand it smooth, and it's going to be even smoother than if you were to just sand it again. Because what you're doing is you're activating the fibers in that wood to, after they get wet, they stand up, right? And so it's going to feel especially rough when I do that water pop after it dries. Then I smooth it out, and you'll find that the finish on your piece is so much smoother than if you were to just go through the grit sanding. So we're going to water pop. Not too much. I like to spray it kind of more open spray, and then I rub it in just a little bit to get all the spots. Okay, so pretty good. Don't see many imperfections. We'll hit this side. Now this is going to get a stain, a gray stain, so we don't have to stress about the color, but we want the piece to be smooth. So you can let it dry, which is what I'm going to do, or if you're in a hurry, you can get a little torch and just kind of lightly go over it. Keep that thing moving so that you don't put burn marks in there because then you don't have to sand those burn marks out. But it's a good way to speed up the drying process. If you see the epoxy video that I did, I actually use that process to dry it out during the sanding process too. Use a torch in epoxy work because you're popping the bubbles. If you want to know more about that, link to the video down in the description. It's a really cool build. But a torch is a good thing to have. Just be careful, you're in a wood shop, a lot of flammable materials. So this will dry. It doesn't usually take very long because you're not soaking it, you're just getting the surface wet. When it dries, I'll come back, hit it with the 220. 220 typically gets it pretty smooth. If you're going to add finish, that's when you're going to add finish after 220. After 220, you put that finish on there, you're going to let that finish dry. When that finish dries, sand it again. I like to go a little bit higher. You got either 320 or this is 400. 400 is a good one. Put another coat of finish after you do 400. Very, very important that you have a clean piece before you put that finish on there. Otherwise, you're going to have a nice gritty feeling finish, which then all your sanding hard work has gone to waste. Don't waste your time. Make sure you clean your piece. All right? Everybody wants a clean piece. So, after you've got that done, if you choose, you could go even higher, 1,000 grit, and you could then put a third coat of finish on there. If you're going that high, unless you're working with epoxy, again, go to that epoxy video if you want to see how I got that glass-like finish on the epoxy. I like to go more of a hand sand. You can get these sheets, these you can find just, typical at Lowe's and whatever. But 1,000 grit, they even go up higher, 2,000 grit. Put it in your hand and just lightly go. If you're going to do that, be sure you're going in the direction of the grain. You don't want to sand across the grain. Even with the finish on there, it's still not going to be a good look. So hand sand when you're getting into those high grits, it's just going to make it, it's going to make sure you smooth it all out. You want that thing butter smooth because when you do that, your hand is going along with it, so you can feel the piece as you're sanding it, and you'll know that you've got that nice smooth piece. Once it's smooth, again, clean it real good. If you're going to spray that third application, do that. Let that thing dry completely, and you are in business. So that is kind of just your version of sanding. There's a lot more to look into when it comes to sanding. Different types of sanders, different types of sandpaper. There's wet sanding, but nobody wants to sit around for an hour-long video. If you want that, maybe I'll put a course together. If you got value out of this video, if you learned something, hit that like button, subscribe, leave a comment. Those things help trying to get this word out there, building this. I do have a podcast now, which I'm just talking mainly the business side, but also we'll go into a lot of the woodworking, tool reviews and things like that. So make sure you go over Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can find the Crafted in Florida podcast over there. Again, we're just talking woodworking, wood shop, business, all that kind of stuff. So thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time. Crafted in Florida. Y'all be good.